Hello there, and welcome back to another video. This is the third episode of the story about how Naruto's life changed after the seal shattered. He's been thrust into Anbu. He's losing track of which half of him is him and which half is his demon. He can't seem to find his way back to Team 7, and he's been having these strange dreams, with a sky ripped apart by a broken moon, a man with a staff, and a version of himself with glowing, nine-tomoe eyes. This story is from Slexinski. Make sure to support him, her. Like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get this party started. And Naruto? Sakura whispered, from where she lay crumpled on the ground. The blonde didn't acknowledge her, focused intensely on the man in front of him. Her thoughts raced, too fast for her to catch up to. Perhaps most noticeably, he'd divested himself of his orange jumpsuit in exchange for a sharp, impenetrable black uniform. His expression turned grave and resolute, features set decisively into a frown. He looked nothing like the Naruto she remembered existing in her memory as a bright, buoyant character in a splintered moment in time. But nothing in the character before her struck her as familiar. He had wide, furious blue eyes, and an unwavering and indomitable composure. Nothing spoke overtly of the blonde she used to know, everything she remembered lost within the quiet repose before her. Orochimaru tilted his head, giving him a quick, appeased, once-over. "You're not what I expected," he regarded, wrapping his fingers against the hilt of his sword. Naruto narrowed his eyes, studying the Sannin in turn. He privately admitted to himself that it might have been slightly remiss of him to barge in here with no backup, but in his defense he hadn't expected Team 7's opposition to be one of the 3 legendary warriors of Konoha. And he'd be damned if he let this guy walk over him to his team. He took a step around the snake, a slow and patient circle around his opponent. The gesture came naturally to him, something he'd seen his captain do time and again when engaged in a one-on-one. "Something tells me that a jounin, missing nin of Konoha isn't supposed to be in the Chunin exams, much less in Konohagakure in general," and then, bluntly, "Why are you here?" It was no great surprise that the Sannin didn't answer him, giving nothing away, slowly running his tongue against his bottom lip. The gesture was unnerving. Naruto scowled, unmoving for but a moment, then he struck for the kill. He was no great master with the sword, however, and it was with significant difficulty that he fended the snake off. He held his own, though, even when it became clear that Orochimaru had stopped playing around, attacking him in earnest. Blade struck, darted away and then struck again. Naruto matched him strike for strike, throwing in a couple well-timed kicks that connected solidly. It appeared Orochimaru was not all that accustomed to fighting against ingenuity. Fortunately, that was practically Naruto's best and only skill. Orochimaru snarled, wiping blood off his cheek from where Naruto had gotten a good hit to his nose. In retaliation, the Sannin came at him faster than he thought he would, diving towards him and catching the blonde in surprise. He ducked under Naruto's guard and drove his sword underneath the blonde's, sending it sailing into the air. It lodged itself into the trunk of a large pine some ways up, and Naruto cursed as he launched himself after it. Orochimaru followed, and Naruto pivoted in mid-air to parry his strike, as the two barreled into a match of taijutsu. The blonde landed a left hook to his face, and they sprung apart, dropping onto opposite trees, heaving loudly. Naruto grabbed for his sword, as Orochimaru climbed to his feet, horizontal on the surface of the tree, brushing his hair out of his face as he caught his breath. His attention turned to Sasuke, swiveling his head to fix his interest on the young Uchiha. All the hairs on the back of his neck rose at the look, and the grip on his kunai tightened furiously. "This is bad," the Uchiha thought, as he looked at his teammates and ex-teammate. Sai lay some distance away, unmoving. Sakura was opposite of him, struggling into a defensive position. Naruto had dislodged his sword, and dropped out of the canopy to Sasuke's side. He didn't know where the blonde had been for the past few weeks, or how he managed to change into this person Sasuke felt he'd never seen before, but he doubted that whatever he had learned, and wherever he'd gone, that it'd be enough to match the monster in front of them. Sasuke stood, holding out the scroll. Take the scroll. He tried as hard as possible to keep his voice level. Just take it and leave us. Sakura's breath hitched audibly. Naruto's eyes widened. Sasuke, what the hell are you talking about? He rounded on him, incredulous. Why would you give the scroll to the enemy? They'd worked hard for it. Exams had not been kind to the team who hadn't that the chemistry from years of working together. Not to mention, finding another would be impossible this late in the exams. To forfeit. I see. Orochimaru tooted. Very smart of you, Sasuke-kun. The only way for prey to escape a predator is to give the predator a different meal. But Naruto had worked around high-profile criminals long enough to know the game Orochimaru was playing. He wasn't the kind of predator to be distracted with a scroll for an exam he didn't need to. Pashi was the kind who had one prey in mind, and wouldn't stop until he had it. And something told Naruto that the scroll wasn't what he was after. But then why bother? Why was he in the exams at all? Who bother Team 7 at all? If he truly wanted to, Naruto was sure he could have found a less obtrusive way of killing them off. Unless, that wasn't his intention at all. But then what did he? Orochimaru lunged for the Uchiha. Naruto intercepted, propelling them both into the bramble. In his absence a Naruto clone dropped into existence, turning livid eyes toward Sasuke. What the fuck is wrong with you? He hissed, stalking forward. In the interim, the real Naruto flew out of the trees, soaring through the clearing. Orochimaru was quick to follow. The clash of swords began anew. The clone descended upon the Uchiha with an uncanny fury. Do you even understand the situation? Do you? Sasuke reputed, equally as angry. Naruto snatched the scroll out of his limp hands, throwing it violently into the trees, where it disappeared from sight. Sasuke sputtered. Naruto turned back to him. You'd forfeit the exams? He accused. Your dream? How are you supposed to get stronger if you can't even pass this exam, huh? That's not. His face clotted red, incensed. But isn't it? Naruto challenged. Don't let him get in your head, Sasuke. The Anbu began anew. What guarantee is there that he'll even let you leave if you give it to him? He looked successfully cowed at his words. Naruto would be a little more enthusiastic that he'd finally gotten the Uchiha to listen to him for once, had they not been sort of fighting for their lives. Before the Uchiha could reply, the Naruto in front of him erupted in a cloud of smoke. The real Naruto skidded to a halt in the middle of the clearing. Orochimaru sprang after him. Naruto caught his strike with the flat side of his blade, using the Sannin's momentum to toss him off. He wiped hastily at his mouth, leaping back to gain some distance between himself and the sadistic missing nin. Orochimaru stood to his full height, head lolling slowly on his shoulders until the hair slid out of his eyes. He lowered his guard. He is correct, Sasuke-kun. He purred. Since I can. He drew one hand to his mouth, and in the next moment bit through his thumb. Simply kill you and take it. His hands flashed through hand signs, an explosion of smoke exploded into the clearing. Sasuke's eyes widened as he watched the large birth of a monstrous head part the sea of clouds, two sets of bright yellow eyes staring down upon him. One from the enormous snake, and one from the sand nin. He staggered back, unable to train his gaze away from the beast slowly uncoiling off the ground. It was massive, it dwarfed everything in the clearing, and when it leveled itself to its full height it could almost touch the tops of the trees. Orochimaru smiled upon them, indulgent and beatific. Go ahead and eat, my dear, he crooned. The snake veered its head towards Naruto, who was still climbing to his feet. He doesn't even have time to shout a warning at the blonde before it struck. The dust clears, the forest is devoid of noise, the birds and small life have fled in the duration of the battle, his teammates are unmoving figures flung onto the far sides of the clearing, what little light is diffused into an indeterminable, archaic gold with the upturned forest flooring, and he couldn't see Naruto. He jumped to a branch some ways up, steadying himself with a hand to the trunk as he searched hysterically for the blonde on the ground. There was nothing. He can't be. Sasuke thought, numb. It couldn't be. Naruto couldn't just die. Gone. Just like that. All at once he felt sick to his stomach, incapable of breathing. The tremendous length of the snake shifted in the retrograde light, scales smooth and shimmering, the color of coal, spitting noises incomprehensibly loud in the death quiet of the forest. He suddenly couldn't stand the sight of it. Naruto. He choked out. Ah, pity, Orochimaru. Digressed, shaking his head. Such wasted talent. He returned his attention once more to his prize. But you, Sasuke-kun, he began, demure. You could be great. You have potential, don't you see? And I am more than capable of directing it towards a greater purpose. He jumped up to the boy, frozen in the trees. We could be great, Sasuke-kun, he smiled, again, it was a rather alarming sight. Sasuke-kun, we can. The snake shook, suddenly. Its scales rippled as it began to quake violently. A moment and then the middle erupted in a volcanic explosion. The snake shuddered apart, ripped wide open as Naruto cleaved his way inside out. The scales flayed away as if burned by the air itself, an electric, corrosive chakra that boiled blood red oozed down the side in his wake, steaming against the ground. He launched himself in the air, surging towards the Sannin. He caught the missing nin unawares. Orochimaru had little time to throw his guard up, and Naruto carved into him from hip to shoulder. The Sannin plummeted to the ground, and Naruto stuck himself onto a nearby tree. That fucker tried to eat me. The blonde yelled, hysterical, peeling away at the intestinal fluids sticking to his arms. Below them, Orochimaru lay unmoving. Ugh, holy shit, holy shit, holy shit. Naruto cursed, wiping at his mouth, heart beating furiously in his chest. He could have died in there. If Kyuubi hadn't. Ugh. That was a fate too horrible to even contemplate right now. He shook out his hair futilely, attempting to regain his composure. This was no time to start lamenting life and death, not when he was walking the tightrope between the two in that very moment. He had to find a way to get a message to his team. And where the hell was Yugao? He didn't have any delusions that he was that good at evasive maneuvering. There was no way he could have thrown her off his trail so successfully. Could he send a bunshin? Maybe while Orochimaru was recover. His eyes snapped open. Sasuke. 2 snake summons. It had completely escaped his notice. The corpse on the ground, and its thinner, more agile counterpart. He hadn't even realized Orochimaru had summoned Tutu, caught up in trying to battle his way out of the stomach of the other one. It reared back, and he could see its glowing yellow eyes fixated wholly on the Uchiha up in the trees, frozen in fright. There was no time. He threw himself into its trajectory. Sasuke, startled, crouched into a defensive position as, if possible, his eyes grew even more surprised. The snake was towering, impossibly so. Its face surely must have spanned the large branch Sasuke stood upon, eyes larger than his whole length and body so tall that he couldn't see the bottom past the shadowed ground. As it loomed in front of him, ready to strike, his mind raced as to how he could possibly defeat such a monstrous creature. He couldn't. He wouldn't even have time to jump out of the way. There was nothing left but silence. Was this death? So quick, so painless, it was as if not even a moment had gone by, but perhaps an eternity or two had passed in the interim. Nothing but an intense, deep silence. And the barest of cracking wood beneath his feet, as the tree groaned with fervor as pressure collided with it. The maw of the snake hung wide in front of him, a dark abyss trailing down from between narrow, razor-sharp fangs. Between the nostrils a thin blade split its face in two, its gleaming eyes unfocused, and beneath it, framed in the dark gullet, a familiar figure. The blonde, his dobe, the academy dropout whose uselessness was only rivaled by Sakura, with a penchant for saying dumb things and who couldn't even make a fucking bunshin, the one who he had believed dropped out of their team because of him and his pompous attitude, the one he felt guilty for ever doubting, for antagonizing silence, and cracked armor just above an Anbu seal. Naruto was Anbu? And wide, unyielding red eyes, leviathan and luminous as if they could burn through his very soul. Are you scared? Their eyes met. Chicken? Two pairs of unnatural, inhuman eyes, red to red, infinity to infinity, and something was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, a world unknown, a world full of demons and sharp teeth and ravens taking to the sky, where the moon was full and, it was saying something to him, the man with the not Sharingan, and the demon with nine-tomoe. But the dream slipped away from him, the besotted, gossamer veil drifted across and Sasuke blinked back into reality. The snake was dead but an elongated tongue wrapped itself around Naruto's torso and dragged him away. I underestimated you, little fox, Orochimaru grunted, drawing the blonde closer. The skin at his chest had peeled away, revealing a second skin below. He twisted in his grip, but Orochimaru had anticipated the danger of allowing him too much leeway and had clasped both his hands and feet. And fuck, he couldn't get a good angle to slice through the tongue. Naruto gritted his teeth. I will not make such a miscalculation again. He felt something ominous grip him, and he found his gaze falling to Orochimaru's hand. He could almost sense the chakra growing there, and an apprehension that felt foreign crawled into his skin. And then, loitering in the narrow channels of blood, a demon stirred to life. Naruto stopped struggling, and Orochimaru tugged him closer, close enough to see the blonde's eyes had dropped shut as he lay motionless. Was he scared? The thought brought him great pleasure. It's all right, Naruto-kun, he murmured, chakra growing in his hand. It'll only hurt for a little bit. He plunged it to the boy's stomach. Naruto's eyes snapped open. He struck, catching the Sannin by the wrist and twisting in his grip to roundhouse him in the face. He howled, clutching at his temple, the tongue fell to the ground, and Kyubi stabbed a kunai through it into the ground for good measure, before darting out of the way when the Sannin came after him. Orochimaru wrenched the blade out of the ground, furious, freeing his tongue. He did not appear particularly indulgent any longer, spitting in fury. Oh, now you decide to show up, eh? Naruto bitched, though without any significant nettle to his voice. Kyubi sneered. It became clear you were incapable of handling the situation yourself. Naruto thought he could hear a frisson of trepidation in there, and wondered just exactly what Orochimaru was about to do to him that had Kyubi so alarmed. Normally Naruto would have taken offense to this. As it were, he was not entirely sure how it could have been any more obvious. No shit, he retorted. Do you have any idea who this? I do, in fact, Kyubi straightened. How very unwise of you to blunder your way into this mess. He was trying to kill my friends. Naruto retorted hotly. No, they would have been dead long before had he been truly trying to kill them, Kyubi murmured, thoughtful. But perhaps that would have been the more merciful option. Naruto turned curious at that, but Kyubi did not elaborate, wordlessly dropping back into position. Orochimaru met him strike for strike, throwing jutsu that Naruto had never seen before at the blonde with a relentless efficiency. No, clearly he wasn't playing around anymore. Naruto would have marveled at the sheer magnitude of jutsu in his repertoire, had he not been facing the full brunt of them. Fortunately Kyubi had taken complete control, darting through the spray with a pragmatic agility, brisk but controlled. Unlike Naruto, Kyubi appeared to have absolute domination over his facilities, evading through the barrage and under his guard. Orochimaru leapt back before he could make contact, harried, tossing a genjutsu in his wake to stall the blonde. It worked for a moment or two, before the blonde awoke and caught himself in freefall, landing on his feet. The Sannin jumped, the blonde followed, indifferent expression as unyielding as his assault. Orochimaru had not expected such a worthy adversary to reveal itself in the young Anbu or anyone out of Konoha at all. The blonde was too fast to pin down, and though he used no jutsu, he was more than capable of holding the Sannin at bay with his sword alone. Orochimaru cursed under his breath, eyes darting towards the Uchiha, still rooted to his spot above, observing. His prize was so close, and yet infinitely far away. He turned back to the blonde, who continued without deterrent, nor legitimate zeal every strike determined and utilitarian. That above all else was worrying. He'd heard from his spies that Naruto had always been a dramatic and emotional child. But the blonde in front of him was sharp and calculating, and if he had any sentiments that Orochimaru could use to manipulate, he could not see them. The blonde propelled himself towards him, and he caught the wakizashi with Kusanagi, close enough to see the searing red eyes turning towards him, indomitable. Red? That was interesting. What could it mean? But Naruto did not give him time to consider this deeply, as he watched with stilted disbelief as the blonde dropped beneath Kusanagi, letting the blade graze his shoulder before he struck at the unguarded Sannin. Orochimaru recoiled in shock, pulling a Kawarimi to disappear onto the opposite side of the clearing. You impudent little brat! Orochimaru spat, false skin pooling down at his feet. His real skin was marred with one sliding gash across his collar. Not enough to cause significant damage but still cause for worry. The clinging flesh sagged on his face, and he drew a hand to tear it all off. This disguise had been useful, he had successfully evaded almost the entire examination staff. It would be quite tedious to find more inventive ways to do so for his escape. He stilled, attention shifting to the trees. On the subject of escapes. He could hear Anbu calls in the distance, and knew that the blonde's team was undoubtedly looking for their wayward comrade. He cursed once more under his breath, eyes sliding to Sasuke. He was running out of time. Naruto lunged towards him, and he allowed the blonde to take the offensive, steering them farther and farther away from his teammates. He kept a fair distance between the two of them, unwilling to let the blonde have yet another chance to pull something unpredictable. Pity he was already so well trained, potential like this would have been a lovely prize to have indeed. Kyubi snarled, surging towards the Sannin when he saw an opening in his shoulder, driving his sword up to plunge it through the tendon and down to the heart. His relish was short-lived, as the man beneath him looked up, mouth dropping open, before he erupted into smoke. Kyubi roared, kicking the log away as he turned furiously around the clearing, searching for the Sannin. He found him, in the trees. Naruto felt his heart shudder to a halt. Orochimaru had dropped his second skin, standing in the center of the clearing with the remnants of a dead woman draped across his feet, exonerated neck twisting upwards. Clasped onto Sasuke's neck. Sasuke! He catapulted himself at the Sannin, but Orochimaru dropped Sasuke in favor of his retreat. Without the other man to hold him up, Sasuke plummeted out of the canopy, and Naruto had only a moment to make his decision. He leapt after the Uchiha, catching him before he could drop to the ground. Orochimaru took the opportunity to dart out of the blonde's range, establishing distance between them, chuckling heartily. My name is Orochimaru, he began as Naruto laid Sasuke down onto a patch of grass, the Uchiha's eyes fluttering closed as his breath turned ragged. No shit, Naruto wanted to say, but his attention as focused on finding Sasuke's heartbeat, erratic as it was. If you ever want to see me again, then survive and pass this exam. A tread of unease shivered down his spine at that. Something told him those words weren't meant for him. His laugh was haunting and hollow in the clearing, even as his body dissipated into smoke, just as the Anbu tore through the trees. An escape, Naruto sneered. That fucker. The next time they met, he definitely wasn't going to let him get away unscathed. Naruto turned his attention once more to his ex-teammate, breathing erratic and unsteady. He could see a mottled, ugly mark making its way to the surface of the skin on his neck, though he didn't know what it could mean. The tendons were still a furious red from where Orochimaru Naruto made a face bit him, tiny indents left from his teeth. He looked up. That sucked, he opined, for lack of anything useful to say. Yamato looked as if he would have found Naruto's indubitable lack of professionalism endearing, had he not been so concerned over the blonde's life. I'd imagine it did, he agreed, solemn, as he made his way to the blonde. He peered down at Sasuke. He's all right? Naruto shrugged, biting his lip. Casualties? His eyes snapped open, and he looked around the clearing. The root member was still unconscious, but Tawa had slung him over his shoulder with no small amount of complaint. Koga was opposite, rousing Sakura. None, he breathed a sigh of relief. And then, threading a hand through his hair, at least not from this attack. He said something about the other Anbu, Yamato finished, sighing. Yes. Unfortunately, he took them by surprise. Sakura struggled to her feet as a crowd of Anbu dropped elegantly from the trees, unrecognizable and almost inhuman with their bone-white masks. Only one was unmasked. She had removed it to hang loose upon her neck, revealing lissomeness features and a livid expression. Sakura was struck by her perfect violet hair and thin, sculpted body, looking infinitely lethal with sword strapped to her back and an Anbu tattoo on her right shoulder. This was a kunoichi, beautiful, elusive, and deadly. Naruto, the woman approached her teammate, holding a fox mask in her hand. The blonde took it wordlessly, mouth open but nothing to say. His eyes watched Sasuke's prone form unwaveringly, turning back to a sky-water blue. The Anbu team immediately revived Sai, who began to cough and sputter to life once more. Yuego, about before, I'm sorry, that was unprofessional. The blonde seemed to find his words in a hoarse whisper, eyes never leaving Sasuke. But you did good, Naruto, the Black Ops praised. That man was a wanted S-class criminal, you were only doing your job, and, as she looked back at Sakura and the broken Team 7. And protecting your friends. Some Anbu I am, the blonde spat furiously. Can't even protect my friends. You did what you could, the purple-haired woman argued, furious herself. She should have followed him. They both should have had communication systems. Those other Anbu in the first place should have called it in, or found a way to inform the rest of the security. Detail. This whole thing was one giant clusterfuck of a mess. She digressed. No point in rehashing the past, not when there was still half of the exams left to go. Tawa, she directed. Locate Mitarashi Anko, get her to the hospital. She motioned towards the unconscious Uchiha, and the debatably conscious root member. Make sure these two receive medical attention. And find Hitaki Kakashi. I don't care if you have to uproot him from a bathhouse, tell him to take a look at this seal. Yes, Tawa replied, toneless, but Naruto could practically feel him rolling his eyes at Yugao's imperiousness. He almost felt rather fond at the sight. It was nice to see his Anbu team again. The relative cheer dissipated when Yugao turned all that attention on to him. And you, she addressed, darkly. Don't think we won't have words. Next time, you bring me, yeah? Right, he nodded, serious and somewhat cowed. And then, apologetically, I knew you were right, Yugao. Maybe I wasn't overreacting, but how were you to know? I had a feeling, that's not really something you go breaking rules for. What happens if it wasn't Orochimaru? If they'd just encountered a regular Genin team that had more experience than they did? He shrugged, looking away. It wasn't enough to go on. You make a fair point, she allowed, at length. But, that said, this time it did work to your favor. Your hunch was correct. However, you do need to explain to your supervisor beforehand, and only with their command do you go running off on one of your feelings. You realize how dangerous that was, right? Had that not been a missing nin, you could have jeopardized the whole exams, and possibly Konoha's relations with other villages. Yeah, he agreed, voice small, slightly horrified. She gave a single, stern nod. Good. Naruto could feel Sakura's unwavering gaze, silently bracing himself for the inevitable. She drew towards him hesitantly, wringing her hands in a gesture that was so very familiar to him, a nervous afterthought she always did when particularly concerned. Naruto, I. She bit her lip, suddenly unable to form proper words. It was difficult to comprehend anything at all of the situation. She'd watched him take on one of the most dangerous criminals arguably in the whole 5 nations, hold his own even. She couldn't relate to him any longer, nothing in him reminding her of that childish little blonde from an eternity ago. Are you okay, Sakura-chan? He asked, pleasantly enough. She couldn't read anything off of his bone mask, however. Her hand trailed up to rub slightly at her shoulder, which had turned a clotted purple. Fine, she answered, timorous. Her eyes flew to him, appeared mostly, miraculously, unscathed, aside from a few noticeable tears in his armor. But are you? He waved her off. I'll be okay. He pointed behind her, to where his teammates had gathered up Sasuke and Sai and were heading over into the forest. You should go with them. She faltered. Sakura, he said. I'll see you soon, okay? She nodded. Right, and then pivoted, taking off into the trees. He rubbed a wary hand through his hair, resigning himself to a long and difficult conversation with his captain. From the looks of things it seemed he did not appear to be in any mood to have a row with his team. Still, Naruto prepared himself. Taicho, he appealed to the man with the tiger mask. This was all my fault. Yugao looked at him sharply. Naruto, it's true, he interrupted his teammate. Yugao tried to stop me, but I intentionally diverted her to help my former team. And, defeated, he added, which is against both the rules of the Chunin examinations and Anbu regulations. Yamato took this all with nothing but a slow nod, no discernible reaction as of yet. Cat? He drawled. It's as he said, she admitted, wary. But ultimately, his foresight stands correct. I only apprehended him only on the assumption that he was acting off of obligation towards his former team. As it stands, the event itself was something against the rules of the exam, and as a result Naruto was only acting as supervisor of the examination. Yamato nodded again, folding his arms. And what in particular was against the rules of the exam? And then, prodding, Kyubi? Naruto startled, incredulous. He gestured broadly to the clearing, torn asunder by the events of the last half hour. Everything? Yamato chuckled slightly. Humor me, Naruto. Orochimaru successfully infiltrated the examinations, killed an ANBU squad and severely injured the second proctor, apprehended a Genin team and placed an unknown seal on Uchiha Sasuke's neck. He is still at large. He summarized. Yamato threw him an approving look. And that's exactly how it's going to go down in the mission report. He concluded. And then, brightly, how do you feel about writing up the report, Naruto-kun? I think you're more than ready to take on the challenge. If possible, his look turned even more incredulous. And slightly horrified. Sakura was panting heavily as they reached the towers. Their Black Ops escort Koga, if she remembered correctly, gave a signal to one of the guards at the top of the tower, and they immediately sprang from their location to inquire their comrade. The ANBU motioned to his charges and explained that they had been attacked by an infiltrated S-class criminal, and under orders of Captain Yamato of Team Shiroi the Genin were permitted to pass the second round without the requirements. At the mention of one, Captain Yamato, the Chunin guards were immediately cowed, and allowed them entrance. Sakura followed with some difficulty, still shaking visibly. Sasuke let out another groan of pain. He'd gone absolutely mental some minutes ago, bellowing in pain and regaining his strength in a sudden show of force, wrestling violently out of the Anbu's grasp. That thing that Orochimaru had put on his neck had begun to twist ominously, crawling up his shoulders and face. The Anbu took him down without much fanfare, and he'd since hovered the fine line between completely comatose and occasional bouts of confused awareness, broken intermittently with his incoherent murmurs. It was disconcerting to see Sasuke reduced to this state. She'd never imagined someone like Sasuke as anything other than infallible. She'd thought the opposite of Naruto, but look at circumstances now. She gathered her courage, and jogged up until she had leveled pace with the towering Anbu member. "Excuse me," she clasped her hands tightly behind her back, "but, I had a question." He gave no sign of acknowledgement, but she took this as a sign of encouragement. "Why is Naruto on your team?" "Who?" He grunted, bored. Equally frustrated and frightened, Sakura tried again. "The blonde." "What about him? Do you know why he's on your team?" She pressed, quickening her pace to keep up with his long strides. "When did he become a Black Ops?" He turned his mask to her. Its expression was marmoreal and unforgiving. "I don't think that's really any of your concern," he observed, somewhat caustically. Sakura's reacted immediately with her first, knee-jerk defensive reaction. "It is. He's my teammate, not anymore," he noted, moving onwards even when Sakura came to an abrupt halt. Sakura paused, coming to a standstill at the apex of the enormous entranceway. The tower sprawled into darkness around her, but her gaze was unfocused. He was right. Kakashi had explained it to them. Naruto was under direct orders from the Hokage now. As typical of her sensei, the explanation was convoluted, vague, and ultimately useless. Sakura had given up in trying to get a straight answer out of the Jounin, coming up with her own conclusions. No matter how much she badgered, he'd only hold up his hands and point out that it was out of his jurisdiction, and all he could do about the blonde's absence was find a replacement. This was met with first her staunch annoyance, and then her serious concern. Perhaps there was no reason to be concerned, however. It was clear Naruto could hold his own. "Sakura-san?" Sai paused in his tracks, turning to her. She shook her head. "Right. Sorry." She caught up to their escort party. The moment Sasuke showed signs of waking, he was hauled off to Kakashi, and apparently by extension the Hokage, the entire tower abuzz with rumors. Or at least, the entire tower aside from the actual participants of the exams. Most of the genin were too tired or too uninformed to care. Sakura and Sai had no time to enjoy the relative respite, as the moment that Sasuke had been whisked off their sickly examinator, Hay-8, ushered them into a large, concave room full of the rest of the participants. It became clear there would be no rest for them at all, as Hay-8 then informed them of the rules of the third exam and the setup for the prelims. Sakura didn't actually listen to a word he said, completely incapable of pulling a coherent thought together at all. She still couldn't believe that had been Orochimaru that they'd seen in the forest. She didn't even know the kind of bounty he had in the bingo book, but she knew it topped 7 figures. God, they could have died. No, they should have died. If Naruto hadn't shown up, who knows what fate could have fallen upon her. She sighed. How could these exams get any worse? The answer should have been obvious. Sasuke was spit up out of the bowels of the tower some moments later, mostly conscious but clearly in no small amount of pain. He refused to acknowledge her, much less explain what the hell happened to him. Sai wisely kept his distance. She could make out a shock of blonde hair up by the Hokage, but it was hard to say if that was Naruto or not. From this distance, it could have been anyone. That said, the blonde was noticeably the smallest figure on the podium, and standing there lined up against the burlish figures of the other Black Ops, it was a fair assumption to say it was her wayward teammate. This became clear when Sasuke's name was called for the first fight of the prelims, and the figure immediately darted off into the shadows. Are we right to let him go? Yugao wondered aloud, watching Naruto escape into the shadows, undoubtedly to interrogate his sensei. She watched him with no small amount of concern. Even Tawa, an oblivious individual by definition, had recognized his grief. Yamato watched the boy out of the corner of his eye, before sighing. Naruto was easy to read, even with his mask tightly covering his face. He was worried for his team, worried for Sasuke, and the boy's crazed obsession with power, rekindled and doubling in size and fervor with the awakening of his cursed seal, worried for Sakura, who looked ready to keel over. Yamato shrugged. That would depend on whether you believe those kids are a beneficial influence, no? He left the question and the answer in the air between them. To be honest, she didn't know. Kids were inherently difficult and mean-spirited. Whether intentional or not, she couldn't imagine that they were the most receptive group, doubly so for someone like Naruto, who came with a palpable stigma. She didn't see anything particularly noteworthy about them, Uchiha included, but perhaps she simply weighed their merit differently than he did. She scowled. She wished someone had tore her away from her own genin team, rotten influence, the lot of them. It was atypical, actually, how intensely Naruto valued his genin team. But perhaps given the circumstances, not particularly surprising. After all, for the majority of his life he had no acquaintances to speak of his own age, involuntarily living through a solitary upbringing. She tensed, watching an illicit black mark pulse against the Uchiha's neck. "Hokage-sama?" she inquired. "Should we detain him?" The Sandaime waved her off. "It hasn't taken over him yet," he remarked. "I'd like to see this play out." She nodded. "Yes." Naruto emerged from the shadows behind his sensei. He flipped a page. "That's impressive, Naruto. You almost got the jump on me." He appraised, mild and incomplete and utter over-exaggeration. Since joining Anbu, Naruto had heard stories about his former sensei. He'd spent most of his time as a genin attempting to wrangle information about his sensei, and the moment he'd stepped into the Black Ops HQ the stories about him were wild, rampant, and completely prolific. He doubted there was anyone who could truly get the drop on Hatake Kakashi. "You appear to be getting quite the handle on Anbu." He wasn't quite feeling up to the praise, though. "Because I'm not completely incapable of silence?" "Thanks," he replied, devoid of any real heat. "No, really." Kakashi turned slightly, snapping his book with something approaching finality. The seal on Sasuke's neck was not fully integrated into his system. Naruto blinked. "Huh? Orochimaru didn't have enough time to merge his seal into Sasuke's chakra, is what I'm saying. Hopefully, as incomplete as it is, we'll be able to reverse it." Some of the stiffness in his frame fell with the words. "Oh. Shit, okay. That's good, right?" Yes it is," Kakashi returned, amused. "Like I said, good job." Naruto bit his lip, shaking his head. "Kakashi-sensei. You weren't there. You didn't see how close we all were to." He swallowed, looking away. He didn't see how Kyuubi had taken over. He didn't see how close to dying Naruto was if Kyuubi hadn't. A swell in the crowd, the bellow of noise rose, and then collapsed into vague murmurs of disappointment. Naruto pushed his way to the front, where Sasuke and a genin he'd never seen before were duking it out center stage. The seal looked wild and erratic, and Naruto thought that he could feel the chakra, untamed and violent as it was. His head snapped to the Hokage's seat, where the impassive Anbu masks watched the match without expression. He knew that once the Hokage gave the signal, Sasuke's dreams of promotion would be crushed. He cursed. Even when they'd made it all this way. "Don't make me do this," he pleaded silently. But just as quickly as it had arisen, Sasuke crushed it backwards, ending his match with a rather impressive display of taijutsu shamelessly stolen from Guy. Kakashi muttered by his side, amused and impressed nonetheless. Sasuke skidded limply across the flooring, and in the next moment the jounin by his side had flickered down in the clearing, catching the Uchiha with his knee. Kakashi hoisted the Uchiha over his shoulder, tossing a vague salute to the Chunin proctor before he flickered back to Naruto's side. A deafening roar of applause took to the air, and from the din he heard two other genin called down for the next match. Kakashi pushed past him, making for the opposite corridor. "Sensei?" He started, but the words fell apart in his mouth when Kakashi looked over his shoulder towards him, motioning for silence. Naruto's brows furrowed, confused for a moment until he recalled Yugao's words in the forest. Something about asking Kakashi to take a look at the seal. His eyes widened. A sudden thought came to him then, and he shot off after the silver-haired jounin. "Kakashi-sensei," he whispered, slightly alarmed. "Listen, about what you said about Sasuke's seal." It's incomplete?" "Yes. So Orochimaru is going to come back to finish the job, not particularly a question." Kakashi nodded again. He tilted his head to the shadows, and through the darkness Naruto could make out the glimmer of bone-white masks. "Ah. A trap, then." Naruto readied himself for a fight, keeping pace with Kakashi. He turned his attention outwards, surveying the area for the chakra he'd felt in the forest. He thought he could smell snakes, but they were in the forest of death. It was fair to say that a lot of snakes lived in the surrounding areas. He tried to recall the way the scent had been when he stood close to Orochimaru, so much more overpowering than just a forest full of reptiles. Naruto scowled. He'd ripped apart Orochimaru's original disguise, who knew what he'd look like now? A few moments and half an unsealing process later, and Naruto wasn't entirely sure what the trap was. Orochimaru lifted himself out of the shadows, and though neither Kakashi nor Naruto were entirely surprised to see him, nothing happened when the missing nin revealed himself. "Long time no see, Kakashi-kun, he greeted. "Not long enough, unfortunately," Kakashi returned with unnecessary cheer. "And young Naruto-kun," Orochimaru addressed, brightly. "I'm impressed. Anbu already? You're shaping up to be quite the Uchiha Itachi." Naruto bristled. "I see the resemblance too," Kakashi nodded, solemn. "You know, it must be the hair." Naruto rolled his eyes, unsurprised that Kakashi didn't seem to be taking this seriously. But Kakashi's demeanor had always been deceiving. "Ah, yes, it must indeed," Orochimaru echoed, absently, his gaze fixated upon Sasuke. "Why do you want Sasuke-kun?" Kakashi asked, dropping to the floor to sit cross-legged, propping an elbow on the unconscious Uchiha. The seals draped along the floor pulsed along, connecting themselves to Sasuke's neck. Orochimaru must have realized as well what those seals were doing to the one he'd placed on the Uchiha's neck. He shook his head. "Ah, how typical, you don't see how fortunate you are, Kakashi-kun. You've already gotten your hands on it." He digressed. "You didn't always have it, no? That Sharingan." Kakashi nodded. "Ah. The Sharingan. Understandable. Who doesn't want one? They're so fashionable." Orochimaru's brow twitched slightly. "And Konoha?" Kakashi tilted his head. "Surely you must know," Orochimaru demurred. "The newly created Hidden Sound Village. That's my village. You should understand just from that." "Foolish ambition?" Naruto threw out, rather meanly. Orochimaru narrowed his eyes. "Something like that," he waved his hand. "Building a village takes time. And many pieces. Important pieces." "Like Sasuke," Naruto noted, sensing where this was going. "Yes, like Sasuke," Orochimaru agreed with relish. He shook his head, sighing dramatically. "You understand, don't you? What you do, what you say. It won't work." Naruto frowned. "To achieve a goal. The heart will accept even the most evil power. I'm an avenger, Naruto. The blonde gripped his katana, suddenly unable to play along with this charade any longer. A hidden village, truly? Captain Yamato mused, revealing himself, crouched upon the ceiling. You didn't strike me as the type to be particularly enthused with paperwork. Perhaps you've misjudged me, Orochimaru smiled, thinly. He clasped his hands behind his back, peering around the room. Ah, but, perhaps I've misjudged you as well. My warmest felicitations, Konoha Anbu, he greeted to the room around them. Someone snorted. Naruto was fairly sure it was Koga. Who says shit like that? Another muttered. Orochimaru bowed low towards Kakashi and Naruto. He leaned towards them, crooning, he will eventually seek me out. To have that power. And then he lunged towards Naruto. In reflex, the blonde unsheathed his sword and drew it into the Sannin. Orochimaru smiled largely at him, before he erupted into smoke. So that was the game? Naruto muttered. Use the Bunshin to give you information? Kakashi shrugged. People like Orochimaru, he gave a vague wave of his hand, are very narcissistic. Their game is all about having power over others, and they relish the chance to show it off. If you can get them talking, you never know what you'll end up hearing come out of their mouth. Naruto rolled his eyes. I'll say. What a weirdo. The Anbu emerged from the corners of the room, at least half a dozen of them. Yamato flipped off the ceiling. Either way, good work, Naruto, he patted him lightly on the shoulder. You might even be able to get into recon work. It's an art, you know? Naruto scoffed. Something tells me this was just a one-time fluke. He couldn't imagine himself being particularly good at lying and espionage. He'd always been much too brash and headstrong for that sort of work. Not to mention he significantly lacked the patience to follow through effectively. Yamato motioned towards the other operatives. They disappeared as quietly as they had come. Before Yamato followed suit, he turned to Naruto. We're briefing the Hokage, he explained, tilting his head questioningly at the blonde. Naruto made a gesture towards Kakashi and Sasuke. I'm just gonna. Yamato held up a hand. No worries. And was gone without even a cloud of smoke to mark his disappearance. I don't understand what he wants with Sasuke, Naruto remarked once the Anbu were gone. His eyes? The Sharingan, yes, Kakashi sighed. Well. It's up to Sasuke now. You don't think Orochimaru will try to lure him out? Naruto asked, curious. Oh no, he will, Kakashi affirmed, bland. But there's not much to do about it. We could, of course, attempt to shadow Sasuke for every waking moment of his day. But as it is, I plan on taking him out for extra training before the third round, as isolated as possible. Will that be enough? Naruto considered, more than a little concerned. Kakashi shrugged. Naruto, he began, noticeably more austere and yet significantly more resigned, we can try all we like to keep him here. And I agree, he is an asset to Konoha and not just because of his bloodline. But if someone really wants to leave. He shrugged again. Naruto sputtered. You'd let him go? No. Kakashi asserted. He would most certainly be hunted by our hunter Nin before we allowed him to sell village secrets off, or in this case, village bloodlines. Naruto paled. Obviously we'd prefer not to have to use that option. Right, Naruto agreed, hollow. He wanted to stick around longer, but he was viscerally aware that his obligations were to his Anbu team now. Sasuke was important to him, unfortunately. Whether he wanted to admit to it or not, he was the closest thing he had to a friend. To family. He eventually made his way back to his team, still lost in his thoughts and unable to work his way around anything else. Kakashi was right. What could you do to stop someone who wanted to leave from leaving? Change their mind, of course. But that in and of itself was a daunting task. He didn't bother with the rest of the exams, lost in his own thoughts. The cursed Sealand by extension, Orochimaru was alarming, regardless of how lowly Kyuubi seemed to appraise him. Naruto was also well aware that what Kyuubi deemed a threat to himself and what Naruto deemed a threat to Konoha were two entirely different sides of an equation. He followed Yugao listlessly out into the open air, once the preliminaries were over. The third exam was set to begin in a month's time. Naruto wondered what would happen in such an inordinately long span of time. The two met up with Hey-8, to which Naruto was genuinely surprised to find was Yugao's boyfriend. He certainly looked a lot healthier in the picture in her living room. Honestly, I told you to pack the coat, didn't I? She remarked testily in response to his sickly appearance. Her boyfriend coughed with an eye roll. It's Suna, Yugao. Honestly, what are the chances of it raining in fucking Suna? You never know. She was mother henningth. Worst part was, Yugao was good at it. Have you even taken any medicine yet? Well no, what the hell do you mean, no? Without her mask, Yugao could look just like a normal girlfriend. Naruto smiled at the two, before leaving them to their arguments, wandering down the street alone. He wondered what Sakura and Sasuke were up to. And he hoped they were alright. After what Orochimaru had said in the backroom. He wondered about Sasuke, and his intentions. Sasuke was an avenger, he already knew that, but would he go so far to seek out Orochimaru? After tasting the power of the cursed seal? Naruto shook his head. Sasuke wouldn't. What the hell? Miki-chan. There's an old man spying here. What? Eek. Naruto barely had enough time before an old man leapt out from the bushes, hightailing it out of the bathhouse's manicured lawn and throwing the telescope at Naruto. Catch, kid. He winked, before jogging off. Naruto blinked, stunned. What? That was, until a horde of angry, scantily clothed large-breasted women trampled out of the bathhouse to skewer the blonde with the most scathing looks he'd ever see. That's him. A blushing buxom brunette was saying to her friend. I saw that telescope. That must be him. What the hell? Naruto cried in surprise as the amassed group of women charged at him. Get him, Miki-chan. He sprinted for dear life, tossing the stupid telescope and making for the trees. Kick him in the balls. The girl with the towel was crying out to her blonde friend. Naruto turned around with no small amount of disbelief to see the girl was gaining speed on him. Scowling, he jumped into the trees, leaving the girls without a trace of where he had gone to. That bastard, Naruto hissed to himself, sniffing the air for the old pervert's scent. I'll get him for that one. He sped around Konoha, a bit surprised at how far that old guy could travel. He finally made it to a bridge near another hot springs, not entirely surprised to see that the old man in question was once again spying on women. This time with binoculars. What the hell was that for, old man? He spat, dropping from the trees. The man replied absently, attention focused on the sight in his binoculars. Naruto wiped them out of his hands, and then vaulted them as far down the river as he could. Hey! The old man protested. Those were my best pair. He finished, belated, staring at Naruto like he was staring at a ghost. Oh. It's you. Yeah. It's me, Naruto repeated, annoyed. Thanks for that, by the way. Quite welcome. He grinned, brightly. I couldn't let them get me, it'd ruin my work. I'm writing a novel. And then, with more theatrical flair than Naruto thought possible, he struck a pose and held up a very familiar orange book into the sun. My life's work. You're fucking kidding me, Naruto deadpanned. You know of it. The old man began to laugh. Ha. As I expected, my novel has received rave reviews from fans of all ages. My perverted sensei reads it, he interrupted. It's total crap. You must be the most perverted guy I've ever met, not to mention the least original writer on the planet. What the hell does that mean? He had the gall to say, appearing far more affronted than necessary, considering the material at hand. Listen kid, people from all over the 5 great shinobi nations read my literary works, I figured even a. And then, with surprise. Anbu like you would have read its great plot. I'm offended you'd think so low of me, Naruto replied, clearly unamused and growing even more so when it became clear the man wasn't paying attention to him at all. Naruto blinked as the man brought his book back down in favor of looking at him curiously. He took note of the big, bright blue eyes, outrageous blonde hair, and whiskered cheeks. Yes, this was Minato's kid, all right. What was surprising was that the boy was a black ops already. Last he'd heard he was a dumb failure who had painted the Hokage mountain, certainly was his mother's kid, and not a prodigy Anbu at age 12. He snorted. There was also another Anbu at 12, and everyone knew how that shit went down. Naruto took a step back, concerned. Can I help you? Good God, this guy wasn't a pedophile too, was he? Well, you certainly look like someone I used to know, he shook his head. If possible, the blonde Black Ops became even more confused. But the super pervert only rubbed his nose and smirked. Follow me. I'm going to teach you a special technique. Wary, Naruto crossed his arms. Do you think I follow people I don't know around on a daily basis? He rolled his eyes. I'm no ordinary stranger. I am Jiraiya, the Sannin. Yes I know, he interrupted, bored. But he was trying to make a point. Having an illustrious reputation meant very little. Look at Orochimaru. People could argue the guy was famous. They could also argue he was a raging pedophile. Good. He smiled wider. Then you should know I have great and powerful things I could teach you. Like porn? He thinks but doesn't say. Alright, Naruto allowed, indulgent. What? The Rasengan. And then, anticlimactically, what the hell is that? He plummeted into the maw of darkness, a cavern of teeth awaiting him at the bottom. Hysteria rose quickly in his throat, and for the umpteenth time that morning, he attempted to call upon the fox. Kyubi. Silence. He plunged further, more silence. 40 feet. He grasped ineffectually at the side of the cavern, but the moisture had long since eroded away at the walls, leaving nothing to grasp onto. Wake up. I'm dying. The great demon stirred, or rather, rolled over. What do you want, you useless? Open your eyes, damn it. 20 feet. Above him, Jiraiya was howling with laughter. What kind of moment was this to be laughing? Do I even want to know how you managed to get yourself into this predicament? I'm supposed to use your chakra to summon a frog to save me from the bottom. Do something. The demon snorted. Absolutely not. Do it yourself. What? Naruto sputtered, wind getting into his mouth and sending him coughing. You heard me. My interference would defeat the entire purpose of letting you train yourself up without my influence. If you don't want to die, which I assume you don't, I highly suggest you deploy some sort of technique to stop your fall. How about holding on to the edge? Why are you so calm about this? Naruto asked in bewilderment. If I die, so do you. The demon said nothing to this, and Naruto tried to stop his fall by hanging on to the edge as the demon had suggested. However, his grip slipped almost immediately, and he couldn't hold on long enough to use chakra to steady himself. Above him, Jiraiya called out, "That won't work. The spikes are too wet." What kind of teacher is he? Naruto hissed, more to himself than anything, more concerned with his death nearing closer than the man's poor teaching skills. 10 feet, and then, some days prior, Naruto eyed the small creature warily. It's... He pointed climactically at the small amphibian. It's a frog. Jiraiya made an indeterminable noise of approval, scrawling into the small book in his lap. At intermittent intervals, he would peer into the small telescope he'd propped in front of him, begin to giggle, and then write once more. Naruto was fairly sure he didn't want to know what was on the other side of that lens. The Sannin spared him a brief, bored glance. I'm pressed to say it's a tadpole still. Seriously? Naruto balked, before looking back down. Privately, he could admit that there was great merit to the sage's words. But hell if he had to try this all over again. It doesn't have a tail. He insisted, more for the principle of the thing than any legitimate defense. So? The old man snorted. You probably just summoned a malformed one. It's pathetic. Hey, he protested. It's not pathetic. It's a frog, okay? It's progress. Toad, Jiraiya corrected, with a grand and resigned capitulation. Silently he bemoaned his life. Why did he decide to give a toad summoning contract to a boy who couldn't even remember that they weren't actually frogs? Meanwhile, Naruto debated the merits of calling this whole thing off. As it were, Kyuubi had managed to train him from a mediocre but somewhat potentially talented genin into a reputable Anbu member in the span of a few weeks. Naruto suspected that there was possible voodoo magic, or maybe just intense training, going on there, but regardless the growth he'd experienced in such a short time frame was eons more than what he was learning now. Not for the first time since he took the Sannin up on his offer, he wondered why the hell he wasn't just allowing Kyuubi to work more black voodoo magic on him. You can't trust the fox, he reminded himself. That he had to remind himself at all was disturbing. Jiraiya had first allured him to the subject of training with illicit promises of ultra-cool jutsu and gravity-defying stunts of grandeur and something that apparently combined both, called the Rasengan. The way Jiraiya explained it, it was a monstrous technique that summoned gale winds like maelstrom. Anbu he may be, but Naruto was still a teenage boy. Offering him ultra-cool super-powered jutsu was like offering a crackhead a block of cocaine. He was practically bouncing on his toes. The fox had found great amusement in Naruto's overreactive imagination, hinting that he may have seen the move in combat himself. Of course, attempting to extract that kind of information from the fox or any information at all was a lesson in futility. Kyuubi did, however, remark that it was a rather dangerous technique, and may be worth putting up with the pervert to learn. Naruto's reproach was not wholly unfounded, but mitigated somewhat when the Sannin brought out a summoning scroll with great flourish with not only his name, but the Yondame's as well. Naruto leapt at the chance to sign himself below Namikaze's Minato, much to Kyuubi's evident amusement. The demon refused to explain why that was so amusing to him, however. Typical. At any rate, that was the most substantial event that had happened all week. What with Naruto's clear inability to summon anything more significant than a sad tadpole. Naruto threw the thing a scowl. It peered back up at him, bored. Irritated, he desummoned the stupid thing to stare ineffectually at the place it had once existed. He wanted to blame someone else, or somehow make this whole mess into some convoluted existential crisis, but the fact of the matter was that Naruto was the only person who had put himself in this situation. He'd gotten complacent since the seal had broken. He suddenly found himself no longer needing those extra hours of practice and training, suddenly found himself capable of great feats that for so long had seemed out of reach. He digressed. There was more to it than that, though. Even when he had full domain over his body, he knew the fox still exercised minute changes in his chakra regulation and energy flow. It was slightly unnerving to know that he hadn't really held full reign over his body since the seal broke. It was also slightly unnerving to realize what it was like to once again live without the fox's power. The contrast was striking. Now that he was completely devoid of the demon's interference, he realized just how much his chakra control sucked. But, he consoled himself, this may not be an entirely realistic standard. After all, he didn't have a millennia or 3 to practice. Unbeknown to the blonde, his tenant was roving around a similar train of thought. For someone so young, Naruto was, admittedly, quite talented. Of course he'd been shunned for most of his life, so it was apparent that the blonde wasn't aware of it. He had yet to realize how vast his reservoirs truly were and how significant of an impact that had on his outward level of skill. Kurama had marveled quite frequently on his current host, and his apparent luck in being housed inside of him. So starved for a soft touch, so utterly and indubitably endowed with chakra. The potentials were limitless, yet it appeared no one else had come to this conclusion. Kurama snorted. No, the attention of Naruto's constituents seemed wholly focused on the young Uchiha prodigy. Also quite talented, but not nearly as susceptible. The snake Sannin had dove straight for the Uchiha, bypassing Naruto entirely. Granted, Kyuubi would have been an obvious deterrent in any attempts. Orochimaru would have to sway Naruto's opinion, as would the boy himself, but assuming the snake had found the correct path to Naruto's interests. But it was for the best. Let them all pander and while away on the dark-haired prodigy. He turned his attention back to the outside world, where Naruto was once again attempting a summon. A small toad flopped bonelessly on the river bank, gasping ineffectually for air. Naruto didn't find it entirely appealing to look at a little blue thing with green spots, but Yugao took one look at it and proclaimed, "It's rather cute." The blonde turned abruptly to see his aubergine-haired companion lounging at the banks of the stream. He gave her an incredulous look. "How?" he said at length. They both turned back to watch it flounder away and almost impale itself onto a rock. Yugao coughed delicately, as if suddenly realizing she'd said that out loud. "What?" "It is." She shrugged, unabashed. This was the second time Yugao had visited him in a week, and something told him this particular visit was not to slap Jiraiya over the head and haul him away from the bathhouse. It finally managed to flail itself into the river, where it shot out into the current for dear life. Naruto sighed, deactivating the summon. True to his assumption, he turned back around to see her holding out a mission scroll. He took it warily. 1000 sharp, Thursday. "Hey, whoa." Jiraiya interrupted, scampering over, looking quite harried. "This is my student. You can't just take him out, you know." "Really?" she deadpanned. Without a fee, he ended with a waggle of his eyebrows. Yugao batted him to the ground with her fist, and then for good measure punted him off the side of the river bank, before turning back to Naruto. "It shouldn't take us more than 3 days at longest." 3 days? Naruto repeated. "I thought we were on leave for the Chunin exams." Yugao gave a noncommittal grunt. "I don't know if you can really call it leave. Great," Naruto huffed. Not that he wasn't pleased to get out of the village and away from the constant and unending vigilance of a certain Sannin, but Kyuubi was still refusing to cooperate. Naruto assumed that if he truly found himself on the verge of death, the demon would rouse himself into action, but he'd prefer to not have to put himself in the situation regardless. "Too hot," Tawa simpered, draping himself onto a large pluming mushroom. The jungle air lay hot and thick in the trees, drenching the ground in a relentless humidity, and no matter how vigorously he fanned himself, trying to cool himself to a reasonable temperature remained a lesson in futility. Because it was Tawa, no one paid him much heed. They also conveniently forgot to remark upon the large palm leaf he'd found to fan himself, which may or may not be poisonous. The clearing was damp and lightless. Not even a speck of sun could be seen from the thick canopy above. Yugao stood stock still in front of the line of trees, no other discernible movement aside from the sword she pulled out from the body beneath her. She waltzed into the dark forest without warning, and Tawa leapt from his throne. "Yugao! Hold up!" He jogged up to her. "I don't want to get lost around here." The two stalked through the jungle, coming to a halt at another opening in the trees. This one yielded significantly more light than the other, and crouched in the center was a young blonde boy, Anbu mask haphazardly pulled to the side. "Hey, Blondie, how goes it?" greeted the lanky Black Ops. Naruto sighed, dropping his head. "Don't ask. That bad, huh?" Yugao gave him an empathetic look. Tawa guffawed loudly. At least he didn't have to deal with all this bullshit. Who would have thought the daimyo would have sent so many people to protect a stupid scroll? "Don't act as if you did anything," Yugao rolled her eyes. "You sat around on a mushroom and fanned yourself with a poisonous leaf," she pointed out. "It wasn't poisonous," protested the brunette, but he stopped short as he examined his swelling hands with nothing short of complete horror. "Still nothing, huh?" Koga called, as he dropped down from the trees. Yamato followed suit seconds later. Naruto pouted. While he was really touched that his Anbu team was being so understanding about his training, it was also beginning to make him feel really unprofessional, not to mention unproductive. None of them seemed to care much either way whether Naruto was in the thick of the mission or not, but Naruto still felt as if he should be contributing something. And so far he hadn't done much of anything, in both the mission and in his training. "I think I'm just incapable of summoning," Naruto proclaimed, dramatically. "I'll just forever have to mourn the loss." "Nonsense," Yamato cut in with a chuckle. "You're probably just not channeling your chakra correctly." Naruto blinked at him. "Is there an easier way to do it?" Yamato made a face. "Ah. Well." He pandered, "Not really, no. It's trial and error for the most part." Naruto scowled back down at his summon, feeling more frustrated than he had been before. "Be patient with it," Yugao advised. "Summons aren't easy. Even trained jounin have a hard time of it." "Really?" Because it seemed like everyone he knew had one. "Yes," she smiled. "Why do you think these morons don't have any?" She jerked a thumb at Tawa and Koga, who mimed shock. Their comms erupted in noise in unison. Yamato motioned towards the south, and both Tawa and Koga disappeared into the canopy above. He turned back to Naruto. "Duty calls," he smiled, strangely jovial. "You just keep it up, okay? Are you sure you don't need my help?" he asked with no small amount of whining. He'd prefer a high-speed chase through the trees than sitting here summoning tadpoles. Yamato laughed. "Just keep working on your summons, Naruto." The blonde sighed. He knew this was pretty much his own fault. But he'd grown reliant on the relative ease that Kyuubi made. Well, everything. Being Kyuubi was exhilarating. Having so much power at his fingertips so effortlessly took his breath away, and he could completely understand how people fell to the intoxication of that kind of power. If the fox hadn't shut him off, and demanded with no exception that Naruto learn this technique by himself, he'd probably never have tried otherwise. The forest grew quiet, and without fighting or a rambunctious and bantering Anbu team to distract him, Naruto returned again to his fruitless work. He felt a stirring in the back of his mind, signaling Kyuubi was awake. "There is no reason to find this so difficult," the fox lamented. "You have proved more than capable of conquering greater feats within a significantly shorter time period." "I actually can't recall a single time that happened," Naruto deadpanned. Because he actually couldn't. Every achievement he'd had in recent memory was influenced by the fox in one way or another. "The Kage Bunshin?" Kyuubi threw out, sounding amused. "Your mission to wave?" Naruto scowled. He'd kind of forgotten about that one time he stole one of the most prized scrolls in Konoha. He could argue the point about the mission to wave, but ultimately conceded that he was right. He hated when the fox was right. Also, how was he always right? Perhaps there is a greater lesson to be learned here than simply summoning toads, the fox began anew. "Please, enlighten me," Naruto opined, flatly. A lesson in patience, remarked the fox, has far greater stipulation and reward than any summoning technique could ever provide you with. Seriously? He grumped. That's a joke, right? But of course it wasn't. Not to mention, and it physically pained him to admit it, but he could even see the fox's point. A couple weeks ago, and even still a little bit now, he would have found the idea of comparing a lesson in making fire dragons come out of your mouth and a lesson in sitting around and being patient heinous and too laughable to contemplate. There is no learning without failure, the fox chided, and Naruto almost thought he sounded gentle. But that couldn't be right. The fox only berated and insulted him and his entire existence. He'd never come to see Naruto as anything but a pest, let alone be nice to him. Yet there was no denying that he sounded less antagonistic than usual. I bet you've never failed at anything in your life. He snorted. He couldn't imagine the demon being bad at anything. If I hadn't, I would never have the strength I have now. Failure is a natural part of learning. If you've never encountered failure, you're doing something wrong. So. What? Just keep trying the same thing? The fox snorts, no. If it's not working, try something else. It's a process, Naruto. To be honest, if you got it on your first try, this would have been a useless experience. This is certainly not above you, Naruto, though challenging. You are more than capable of mastering this technique. As it is, you may perhaps come to learn something marginally useful, that is, of course, if you even manage to retain the knowledge in that insipid brain of yours. The hey. He scowled. Cynical and reproachful, that was more like it. He returned to his summon, but found he couldn't keep his concentration. He turned Kyubi's words over and over again in his head, reluctantly agreeing with him. If he wasn't learning anything, why bother? But what bothered him even more than the fact that he actually found himself agreeing with the fox was that he was about to thank him. Naruto flushed, lost his concentration, and ended up summoning what looked more like a mephitic pancake than an amphibian. He cursed, and desummoned it with a wave of his hand. Why the hell would he thank the demon? Everything Kyubi does is for his own interests, as he'd so helpfully reminded himself earlier. The fox didn't care for anything or anyone other than himself, and if it seemed like he did, it was ultimately to further his own gains. And he knew this, of course. So why was it so hard to make himself believe it? Naruto eyed his summon appraisingly. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't as cool or as interesting as a summon as, say, Kakashi's Nin dogs or something, but it had at least approached something that might even be considered acceptable. Useless, but acceptable. But on the subject of uses, what kind of use would he ever find in having toad summons? Kakashi's Nin dogs worked as trackers, fighters, and occasionally babysitters when Kakashi didn't feel like showing up to training. Yugao's boyfriend had raven summons that he used for scouting and recon. He had no idea what benefits toads gave him, aside from the fact that the fourth Hokage also had toad summons. He digressed. It hardly mattered. It was the principle of the thing. He'd realized sometime after his conversation with Kyubi that he'd probably be getting more value out of the act of learning to summon than the actual summons themselves. Oi, Naruto called, finding, to his annoyance, that Jiraiya was still crouching in the trees, spying on the bathhouse. Were all the Sannin kind of crazy? He wondered with growing concern on their last teammate. Who the hell knew what kind of crazy shit they got up to, if their teammates were anything to go by? Hey, pervert! He shouted, throwing a rock for good measure. Jiraiya ducked, as he had assumed he would, but the pebble soared through the air to land loudly in his actual target, the baths. The women inside shrieked angrily when they realized someone was across the fence being a creep, and promptly shuffled back inside. Jiraiya gaped. How could you? He accused, angrily. I was getting great inspiration. No, you were being obnoxious, Naruto drawled, rolling his eyes. And gross. You know, it's really not okay to be spying on naked women all the time. Nonsense, it's all for the sake of art. Jiraiya waved him off, jumping out of the tree. He made his way towards the blonde, gaping. That's it? What? Naruto reared back, defensively. It's not even a real toad. Hey, the toad protested blandly, looking less offended and more bored. Sure it is. Naruto disagreed. It even talks. It's a summon. Where's your ambition? Jiraiya digressed, loudly and with way more theatrics than necessary. Don't you want to summon a bigger one? Or even the boss himself? Not really, Naruto retorted woodenly. I've wasted enough time as it is. I do have a team to get back to, you know. I can't keep shirking my job for your training forever. Jiraiya sighed. Well, at least allow me a final test. To prove how much you've learned, if you will. The only thing Naruto really learned out of all of this was patience and acceptance, neither of which were things that could be tested. Jiraiya led him up a large, winding hill on the outskirts of the village. He grew more and more concerned the higher they climbed. Just what the hell was this final test? He'd assumed it'd be something as ridiculous and ambiguous as his summoning training. The wind scraped at his hair and the ends of his jacket, and he scowled at the figure in front of him, as if it was somehow the Sanin's fault that the weather chose to be temperamental today. Okay. He proclaimed, stopping abruptly. This is it. This is what? Naruto looked around. There was legitimately not a single thing in sight. They had made it to the edge of the ravine, an ominous and seemingly unending drop not far in front of them. The final test. Right, Naruto agreed, slowly. Obviously. You're to use your new summoning capabilities to save yourself, Jiraiya commanded. And nothing else, you hear? Summoning only? Naruto turned to him with a look of mild trepidation. Save myself from what? But then Jiraiya had bodily pushed him off the cliff, sending him spiraling into the abyss. His first and most illogical thought was, I guess there's a reason he's a Sannin after all. He hadn't even been able to see the old perv move, which said something, considering even without the fox his reflexes had grown tenfold. It quickly became apparent that he didn't have the time to debate the prowess of the toad sage when he barely had enough time to save himself. Stupidly, and against all reason, his first rational reaction was to call Kyubi. But he'd been doing that since this morning, with little to no results. Had he the time to really deliberate on this, he would have been somewhat bothered by the fact that his first reaction was to call Kyubi to save him should be more than capable of saving himself, damn it, but as it were the fox might be his only opportunity out of this. He tried the ledge, too wet. Even if he gathered enough chakra to stick to the watery surface, he still had to worry about his momentum. Did he know any jutsu to cushion the fall? Kyubi probably knew dozens. Meanwhile, Jiraiya peered over the edge, more curious than he'd thought he would be. He was still a bit blindsided by the fact that Naruto was in Anbu already. On some occasions it was obvious to see why. He projected a maturity that Jiraiya hadn't expected, was incredibly talented with a sword, and clearly had the reflexes and facilities of a fully trained shinobi. But on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, it was clear he knew little to no jutsu, or if he did, never used them, and periodically exhibited the normal behavior he'd expect from someone his age. But more than anything, he looked lost. As he watched the blonde freefall down the cavern, he vowed to find his old sensei and see what he had to say. No doubt Sarutobi was fully aware that he was in the village, and even that he was training Naruto, so perhaps he'd actually be forthcoming with his answers. But with his old sensei, it was always difficult to tell. The bottom of the pit erupted in an enormous cloud of smoke. It soared up the walls and buffeted Jiraiya's face in a blast of wind. He staggered back, caught off guard. When he peered down again, it was with shock and awe. The enormous birth of Gamabunta lay squished in the small space, and the toad was loudly and intermittently complaining about the lack of room. Naruto ignored the complaining toad, sprawled on top of its head and gasping for breath. He wasn't actually exhausted, but it felt like his heart had been working overtime. Probably all the stress at the rate his life was going, he might need to have a legitimate concern over death by cardiac arrest. It was with no small amount of mortification that he realized yes, Kyuubi did actually save him. He palmed his face. Damn it. The fox's amusement was evident. At the very least, your body will now remember how to use the summoning jutsu. Not that I had anything to do with it, he grumbled, letting his head roll listlessly to the side. In hindsight, he had no idea why he hadn't just jumped off the toad and laid on the ground. The thing wasn't actually all that comfortable. I wouldn't be so sure. The fox trailed off. Naruto blinked. Before he could think on Kyuubi's words, he was already speaking again. Listen closely, Naruto. Not too far in the future, you will inevitably meet more of these toads. I don't know when, but I surely expect you will, as this man is your teacher. It is imperative that you travel to their homeland. What? Wait, summons have a homeland? Also why? Never mind that, the fox retorted. It is called Mount Myobokuon of the toads can take you there using the reverse summoning technique. There's a reverse summoning technique? Naruto balked. But the fox had retreated one more, leaving Naruto alone. What's his problem? Naruto muttered crossly. As usual, nothing he was saying made sense. What are you talking about up there, brat? Bellowed the toad beneath him, much to Naruto's surprise. He'd kind of forgotten the thing was still here. And who are you? I'm Uzumaki Naruto, he introduced, rather belatedly. I'm the newest guy on the summoning contract. Summoning contract? The toad repeated, narrowing his eyes. Jiraiya is here? He snorted then. Don't lie, punk. There's no way in hell a little shrimp like you could summon me. Naruto scowled, mutinous and ready to fight him on it, before he decided to use his newfound patience and maturity to manfully refrain. Believe what you want, he shrugged, dropping down from the toad. Oi, I am not done talking to you, you brat. He shouted after him. Who the hell do you think you're talking to, eh? Naruto paused, pivoting around, hands on his hips. Well, how the hell am I supposed to know who you are if you haven't introduced yourself? He pointed out, churlishly. Isn't it obvious? The toad balked. Not really, no. I am Gamabunta-sama. The Toad Master. Whatever that was supposed to mean. The blonde's attention drifted upwards, where a small sliver of sky remained a wicked and indomitable presence far above. He couldn't see the silhouette of the other man anymore. Hell, if he just up and left. No way this kid could manage to summon me. Gamabunta snorted, before pausing. Now that he was really looking at him, he looked rather familiar. Almost like. He blinked. But no, it can't be. The Toad Master pulled out the contract, taken aback. So the kid really did do either. It was Uzumaki Naruto, right beneath Namake's Minato. Uzumaki? He echoed, aloud. But wasn't that Kushina's last name? Oi, Gaki, he tucked the contract away. Was your mom Uzumaki Kushi? He looked down. The boy had collapsed. He looked like he was passed out cold, and there was no Jiraiya in sight. Gamabunta sighed. In his dreams they were almost touching. The scene is familiar, the same scene that has housed his dreams for the past few months. A barren wasteland spreads before him, infinite. The sky above is an indeterminable color with no sun or stars, nothing is left in it but for the cold and wan moon. It is broken apart, splintered into spines and teeth, leering at him. Watching him. Part of him. His attention is drawn to the boy in front of him. It is himself. He finds he is fascinated by the luminous and unfaltering gaze. In his eyes of morning the land of dreams begins. Claret red, distorted by an intricate pattern of black. Upon closer inspection he sees them to be infinite rings, little cathedrals, alcoves unguessed that open as a sigilless glass to the light. They look irreducible, changeless like rind, the proportions arcane and acerb. They are alarming, and yet intimately familiar. A vociferous, saturnine expression drifts across his face, gone as quietly as it had come. He wants to catch it and hold it in his own hands, if only to prove that it had been there at all. Instead, he reaches for the other boy's hand. It is as cold as the moon. It comes to him, suddenly, why his eyes are so strange and yet familiar. The dream breaks then. He feels it in the very calendar of his bones, drowning at the heart, collapsing inwards from skin to soul. His eyes flutter open slowly, filtered light warm against the side of his face. He finally got around to replacing those shutters, and already one is broken. Wait, why were there no shutters on his window? He scowled, pulling himself upright as he paused at his eyes. He tried to grasp at the fading memories of his dream. The Sharingan? He thinks, just as the world of dreams wanders away from him. And then, once reality sets back in, what the fuck? Oh God, he despaired, once he realized where he was. I fainted, didn't I? How could he possibly be this lame? If it's any consolation, it was only for an hour or so. Naruto startled at the voice, not surprised by the other presence in the room, but at who it was. He'd felt it the moment he'd awoken, and assumed upon consciousness for it to be any one of his teammates or former teammates, possibly even Kakashi. Shikamaru, he greeted, smiling. What are you doing here? I could say the same of you, the brunette returned, dry as ever. You didn't even participate in the exams and yet you still managed to land yourself in here. It's a talent, you know, Naruto whispered, conspiratorially. Shikamaru rolled his eyes. Well, whatever it was, it must have been something pretty bad, Shikamaru noted, lightly. It's pretty hard to land an ANBU in the hospital. Naruto blinked, slow. Oh. He looked down and confirmed that yes, he was not wearing anything but his chest plate, leaving the rest of his body completely exposed, tattoo included. He rubbed the back of his head, chuckling. Huh, well actually I did this to myself. Even more impressive. Shikamaru snorted, to his relief. It seemed like he wasn't going to make a big scene of it. Huh, good old Shikamaru. But definitely not surprising. So, seriously, what are you doing here? Naruto leaned over to kick off the blanket, relieved that Shikamaru didn't appear to want to make a big deal out of it. He'd probably think it all too troublesome, anyway. You weren't injured, were you? Shikamaru scowled. My fight wasn't interesting enough for me to get injured, to be honest. Why does that not surprise me? Naruto laughed. It was probably too troublesome to make it entertaining, right? Precisely. Shikamaru smirked. But then he heaved a great sigh, looking put upon once more. But on the subject of troublesome things, I'm actually here to visit someone. Oh? Who? There were still genin in the hospital? Naruto paused. Well actually, it hadn't really been that long, had it? Not even a week. Rock Lee. Shikamaru jerked a thumb behind him. Want to come? Sure, Naruto shrugged. He didn't really have anything else to do, and he rarely had an excuse to hang out with the lazy Nara. Shikamaru had always been the one and only kid from their class that never said anything mean-spirited about him, to his face or otherwise. Although honestly this was most likely because he couldn't be bothered to go out of his way to talk badly about someone. He'd expected it to be a rather routine meeting of friends, small talk, probably a whole lot of questions about his promotion, and maybe some updates on their peers. Instead, Rock Lee was knocked out cold, with the one-tailed Jinchuriki looming over him with what looked like some serious intent to kill. Naruto felt his hackles raise, acting on instinct. Before he even knew what he was doing, he ducked underneath the redhead's guard and pinned him to the wall. He had no weapons on him, but his hand hovered just slightly over the Sunanin's neck, thumb and forefinger poised to crush the trachea. He leapt back as suddenly as he'd launched himself. He looked about as surprised with himself as Gaara did. "You're outside of the exams," Naruto noted, coolly, once he'd regained composure. "Killing a genin from another country is a great way to get yourself kicked out of the exams and possibly even start a shinobi war. I'm assuming you're not really up for either of those options." Gaara blinked, owlish, at him. "So you assume," he began, slow and quiet, "that I care about either of those options?" His eyes narrowed. Gaara raised a hand, and an obedient trail of sand pooled out of his gourd. He drew the hand over Rock Lee's unconscious form, his eyes never once leaving Naruto's, as if goading him to stop him. "Don't even try me," he thought. This was a bad day to get on his nerves, he was feeling rather homicidal. But the redhead didn't move further. In fact, it appeared he'd stopped moving at all. Even the sand had stopped swirling around him. "I've got him," Shikamaru revealed, voice low. Naruto caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of his eye. So this must be the infamous Nara clan shadow jutsu. He scoffed. "And yet he's still so cocky. Don't think for a second that we're the only ninja in here," Naruto bluffed. "This place is crawling with Anbu, most of which would probably leap at an excuse to kill you. You really want to take that chance?" Actually, he had no idea if that was true, but how the hell would Gaara know that? "Get in my way and I'll kill you," the redhead replied, bland, as if perhaps he was ruminating on the weather. Naruto scoffed. "I'd love to see you try." "Naruto," Shikamaru hissed. "Stop goading him. You don't understand, his strength is like a monster. You didn't see it in the Chunin exams, but I did, actually. I had the unfortunate pleasure of proctoring the second task." Naruto interrupted. "He's no monster. If anything, he's just a creepy kid who hides under people's beds." "What did I just say about provoking him?" Shikamaru grumbled, looking more and more alarmed by the second. Maybe it was an unfounded fear, as he doubted Naruto was promoted to Anbu for no reason, but he'd still prefer to not take the chance. Gaara didn't respond, aside from a slow, almost unnatural blink. "Not a monster, huh?" he repeated, impassive. "I'm sure you'll find that isn't the case." The blonde snorted. "Having a monster and being a monster are different, you know." Gaara's eyes widened, the first actual emotion to catch upon his face. "And what are you without it, huh?" he continued. "Nothing. Just a regular kid. Don't think you're special or anything." His impassivity well and truly broke at that, something like shock taking its place before a heady rage swept through his features. Before he could even attempt an attack, Madogai made the most heinous and dramatic entry Naruto had ever seen in his life, and tackled him out of the way. Gaara slinked off after that, clearly unwilling to take on all three of them. He gave a pensive and uneasy glance in Naruto's direction. Naruto waved back with a nasty smile. "Fuck, Naruto." Shikamaru sighed, now that the danger was long gone. "Let's not do that again, yeah?" "Agreed," Naruto muttered, casting a dark look at the door Gaara exited out of. He wondered what kind of relationship Gaara had with his demon. It appeared to be even more fucked up than Naruto's, which was saying something. There was no sign of Jiraiya, his team, or even Kakashi, which while unusual was not entirely surprising. It's not as if any of them were his keeper, or anything. He wasn't sure how long he'd been unconscious, but he managed to weasel out of a discouraging-looking nurse that Gamabunta had tossed him out on the front steps. Great. As if this could get any more embarrassing. He was actually a little thankful none of his team was here to see this. He doubted he'd ever be able to live it down. The interim between the second and third exams came and went with little fanfare. Naruto ate a lot of ramen, read a lot of bad fiction, an unfortunate habit he'd picked up courtesy of Yugao, slept, ran missions, and trained not always in that order. He'd never expected to find himself comfortable enough with his life to even begin to think of it as monotonous, but he was starting to fall into a rhythm he could get a hold of. If possible, him and Kyubi appeared to be on entirely different faces of the earth. Which was ridiculous. They shared the same body. How the hell was it possible to not have a single interaction with him during such a large stretch of time? No matter how improbable it sounded, it was true. Naruto saw neither hide nor tail of the fox. Obviously his Anbu team was seeing a lot of him, but there were even occasional missions where the fox didn't come out at all, leaving Naruto to have to work in his place. They said he didn't seem all that different, but Naruto wouldn't be able to confirm or deny that anyway. The fox was blocking him. And if that wasn't terrifying, Naruto didn't know the meaning of the word. What did the fox get up to when Naruto didn't have conscious awareness of him? Fuck him, Naruto scowled. Who needed him, anyway? He was perfectly capable of handling his life on his own well, most of the time. Okay, actually something a lot less than most of the time. Something wrong? Yugao's voice startled him out of his thoughts, and he turned to see her entering the Hokage tower from the front door, which was remarkable, because almost every ninja he knew had some strange fascination with coming in from random windows. Ah, nothing, Naruto lied. Just thinking about the third part of the exam. Yugao snorted. Really? All I'm trying to think of is when it's going to be over. Such blatant disapproval was rather peculiar for the violescent ninja. Normally she at least attempted some modicum of professional propriety. Then again, she probably had some experience with the tournament part of the exam and more importantly, with how awful it was going to be to proctor it. They met up with Tao and Koga at the top of the stairs, and made their way towards the Hokage's office. There were a few other Anbu teams loitering around the outside. He could hear muffled voices from the other side of the door. What's going on in there? Naruto asked, low, as to not draw attention with all the sensitive ears around. The captains are in there. Yugao explained. Probably doling out what responsibilities go to which teams. And Tao began, conspiratorially, what teams don't get any responsibilities at all. I hope it's us, Koga muttered. I've had to work this thing every time it's been here. Tawa scoffed. What, like you have anything better to do? As a matter of fact I do, Koga sniffed. A hot date, then? Yes, actually. Koga hissed. And more importantly a hot night after. But I can't have the night without the dinner first. Well, why would you schedule it on the same day of the exams in the first place, if you knew you were probably working it? I didn't know the exams were going to start today. Did you not check the fucking calendar? Naruto gave a wary look towards Yugao, and then towards the rest of the hall, as their voices steadily increased in decimal with each passing second. But Yugao didn't look all that surprised with their complete and utter lack of decorum, and to that end, neither did anyone else. Don't worry, Yugao rolled her eyes. No one in here is laboring under the delusion that either of these two morons have any sense of dignity. The both rounded on her. Hey! But the Hokage took the opportune moment to dismiss the meeting, and whatever argument could have happened died a still death as the doors opened. It was a little inspiring, actually, how quickly Tawa and Koga could pull an about-face when Yamato walked into the room. I have pleaded in our defense, Yamato began, decorously, and my request has been answered. Weary on the bench for this one. Tawa looked as if he may just drop to his knees and pray towards their captain. As it were, Koga repeatedly mocked a praising bow, hands held above his head with reverence. Don't get too excited, he cautioned. We still have to be there. But technically not in an official capacity. Not unless we need to be, anyway. So we're still backup, Yugao sighed, before shrugging. Well, it could be worse. Koga immediately stopped bowing, mouth opening in shock. No, he gasped in horror. Why? He hung his head. I was so close. Tao's chuckling turned into full-blown laughter at the other Anbu's expression. Better luck next time, sucker. Yugao looked as if she was dutifully attempting to ignore them both. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear anything of this conversation, she announced, before pivoting smartly on her heel and waltzing through the crowd of ninja without a backwards glance. Yamato turned to him curiously. Do I even want to know? Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.